The Joker didn't start as evil. He was created by every single one of us who chose to look the other way when someone desperately needed help. This isn't just the story of Arthur Fleck. This is the story of how civilized society systematically manufactures its own nightmares, then acts surprised when they come home to haunt us. What you're about to hear will disturb you not because it's fiction, but because it's the most honest mirror our culture has ever produced. The Joker isn't the villain of this story. We are. Arthur Fleck begins as society's ultimate victim. A man so broken, so desperate for connection, that he literally cannot stop himself from laughing at the worst possible moments. His condition isn't just medical, it's symbolic. He's laughing because the alternative is screaming, and society has already told him that his screams don't matter. Picture this. A man who works as a clown whose entire job is to bring joy to others, going home every night to care for his mentally ill mother in a crumbling apartment. He takes 7 different medications just to function. He sees a social worker who clearly doesn't want to be there. He writes jokes in a notebook that no one will ever read. He practices conversations in the mirror because real human interaction has become so foreign to him. This is where the trickster archetype begins to corrupt. In healthy societies, the trickster serves a vital function. They use humor to point out uncomfortable truths, to challenge authority, to heal through laughter. Think of court jesters who could mock kings without consequences, or comedians who unite audiences by highlighting shared absurdities. The trickster is supposed to be society's pressure valve, releasing tension through cathartic laughter. But what happens when society doesn't just reject the trickster's message, but the trickster himself? What happens when the healer becomes the outcast? Arthur's first real glimpse into his future comes on the subway. 3 drunk Wall Street types harass a woman, then turn their aggression on him when he can't control his laughter. These aren't random criminals. They're successful members of society, the type of people who shape policy, who decide who matters and who doesn't. When Arthur finally fights back, when he kills them, something fundamental shifts in the city's consciousness. Suddenly, Arthur isn't invisible anymore. But the attention isn't for his pain or his humanity. It's for his violence. Society finally notices him, but only as a threat. The media immediately transforms him into a symbol without ever trying to understand the person. They don't investigate why a man would snap like this. They don't examine the systemic failures that led to this moment. Instead, they turn him into either a monster to be feared or an icon to be worshipped. Both responses completely erase Arthur the human being. This is the crucial moment where society reveals its true nature. When faced with the consequences of its own neglect, it doesn't examine its failures. It creates narratives that absolve it of responsibility. Either Arthur was always evil, making his suffering irrelevant, or he's a righteous rebel, making his violence justified. Neither story requires society to change. The transformation accelerates when Arthur discovers the truth about his origins. His mother, the one person he thought loved him, had allowed him to be abused as a child. She had created a fantasy about their relationship with Thomas Wayne to cope with her own mental illness. The social worker who was supposed to help him gets her funding cut. His medication disappears. His job fires him for defending himself. Every single support system fails simultaneously. This isn't coincidence, it's design. Our society is structured to let people like Arthur fall through the cracks, then punish them for landing at the bottom. But here's where the psychological horror truly begins. Arthur's mind doesn't just break, it adapts. When reality becomes unbearable, the psyche creates new realities. His relationship with Sophie, his neighbor, exists entirely in his imagination. His appearance on the Murray Franklin show, his moment of triumph, might be fantasy too. The line between what's real and what's delusion becomes irrelevant because Arthur's internal world has become more vivid and meaningful than the external one that rejected him. This is the birth of the Joker. Not through a vat of chemicals or a single traumatic event, but through the slow, methodical destruction of a human being's connection to reality and meaning. When society offers you no role, no value, no recognition of your basic humanity, madness becomes the most rational response. The Joker makeup isn't disguise, it's revelation. It's Arthur finally showing the world who they created. The white face, the red smile, the green hair, they're not hiding his identity, they're announcing it. This is what you made me. This is your handiwork. The dance down the stairs isn't celebration, it's funeral procession. Arthur Fleck is dead, murdered by collective indifference. What remains is something society can finally see clearly, because it speaks their language, violence. But here's what makes this transformation so insidious. The Joker gives Arthur what he always wanted: attention, purpose, followers, relevance. For the first time in his life, People care about what he has to say. They hang on his every word. They see him as important. Of course he embraces it. Wouldn't you? The tragedy isn't that Arthur becomes the Joker. The tragedy is that becoming the Joker works. It gives him everything society withheld when he was trying to be good, to be normal, to contribute positively. The system literally rewards his transformation into a monster while punishing every attempt he made to be human. This is where the story becomes a mirror for every person watching. How many times have you ignored someone's obvious distress because acknowledging it would be inconvenient? How many Arthur Flecks have you passed on the street, in the office, in your own family, without really seeing their desperate need for basic human recognition? The protesters who adopt the Joker's image aren't supporting Arthur personally. They don't know his story, his pain, his specific humanity. They're using him as a symbol for their own feelings of powerlessness and invisibility. He becomes a blank screen onto which society projects its accumulated resentments. This is the final stage of his dehumanization. Even his supporters don't see him as a person. The genius of the Joker archetype is that it reveals the hollow core of our social contract. We tell ourselves that civilization is built on compassion, justice, and human dignity. But the Joker exists because those are lies we tell ourselves while systematically marginalizing anyone who threatens our comfort or challenges our assumptions. Every society gets the monsters it deserves. Medieval Europe created stories about vampires and werewolves, creatures that represented fears about disease, transformation, and loss of humanity. Modern America created the Joker, a monster born from loneliness, mental illness, and social abandonment. Our monsters always reflect our deepest failures as a culture. The most disturbing aspect of Arthur's transformation is how preventable it was. At multiple points, small acts of genuine kindness could have changed his trajectory. If his coworkers hadn't mocked and betrayed him. If the social worker had actually listened. If the comedy club audience had shown basic human decency instead of cruel indifference. If Thomas Wayne had responded to his pain with empathy instead of disgust. But these interventions didn't happen because they required seeing Arthur as fully human, and society had already decided he didn't qualify. His poverty, his mental illness, his social awkwardness marked him as expendable. Once you're categorized as expendable, your suffering becomes invisible, your potential irrelevant, your humanity negotiable. This is the machine that creates Jokers. Not dramatic trauma or evil genetics, but mundane, systematic dehumanization. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, each so small that no single person feels responsible for the final outcome. The Joker's laugh isn't expression of joy, it's the sound a human soul makes when it finally stops trying to connect and starts trying to destroy. It's the audio signature of hope curdling into malice. When Arthur laughs while confessing to murder on live television, he's not celebrating violence, he's mourning the death of his own capacity for love. Understanding this doesn't excuse his actions, but it explains their inevitability within the system that created them. The Joker isn't an aberration, he's a natural product of social dynamics that prioritize order over justice, image over substance, comfort over truth. The real horror is that Arthur's story isn't unique. Right now, in every city, there are people following similar trajectories. They're sitting alone in apartments taking medications that barely work, seeing therapists who don't have time to really listen, working jobs that treat them as disposable, loving families that can't love them back the way they need. They're writing in journals that no one will read, practicing conversations they'll never have, laughing when they want to cry because crying has been forbidden. Some of them will break silently, disappearing into addiction, suicide, or complete social withdrawal. Others will break loudly, becoming the school shooters, domestic terrorists, and mass killers that dominate our news cycles. But they all start in the same place, as human beings desperate for connection in a society that has perfected the art of looking away. The subway scene where Arthur first kills reveals another crucial layer. His victims aren't random criminals, they're representatives of the system that created him. Young, successful, entitled men who see someone's obvious distress and respond with mockery and violence. They're not evil in any dramatic sense, they're just products of a culture that teaches them that people like Arthur don't matter. When Arthur shoots them, he's not just defending himself physically, he's rejecting his assigned role as victim. For the first time, he's refusing to absorb society's cruelty without response. The problem is that once you cross that line, once you decide that other people's humanity is conditional, there's no logical stopping point. This is the Joker's fundamental philosophy. If society treats human dignity as negotiable, then all humans become potential targets. If compassion is reserved only for the deserving, then everyone becomes potentially undeserving. The Joker doesn't create this moral framework, he just removes the comfortable illusions that hide it from view. The transformation reaches its climax during Arthur's appearance on the Murray Franklin show. Murray represents everything Arthur thought he wanted to become. Successful, loved by audiences, genuinely funny. But when Arthur finally gets his moment in the spotlight, Murray treats him exactly like everyone else has, as a curiosity to be mocked rather than a person to be understood. Murray's sin isn't unusual cruelty, it's ordinary blindness. He literally cannot see Arthur as a complete human being with valid experiences and legitimate pain. Even when Arthur explicitly tells his story, explains his suffering, reveals the system's failures, Murray responds by focusing on Arthur's lack of conformity to social norms rather than the norms that failed Arthur. This is the moment when Arthur fully becomes the Joker, not because he commits murder, but because he stops trying to make society see his humanity. The murder is just the external manifestation of an internal surrender. He's giving up on the possibility of connection and embracing the power of terror. But the most chilling aspect of this transformation is how it reveals the audience's complicity. When Arthur kills Murray on live television, the studio audience doesn't respond with universal horror. Some are clearly disturbed, but others seem fascinated, even entertained. Society has created a population so hungry for authentic emotion, so starved for genuine human drama, that they'll applaud murder if it feels more real than the scripted performances they're used to consuming. The Joker becomes a symbol for social revolution, but it's revolution without positive vision. It's pure negation, the desire to destroy what exists without any plan for what should replace it. This is what happens when society pushes people so far beyond hope that they can only imagine ending things, never improving them. The protesters who embrace the Joker's image aren't following Arthur specifically, they're following the idea that their pain and anger matter enough to disrupt the system that created them. They're not organized or ideological, they're just desperate for acknowledgement that their suffering is real and their exclusion is unjust. This is perhaps the most prescient aspect of the story. It predicts how social media and modern communication would allow isolated individuals to find each other and amplify their grievances into collective action. The Joker becomes viral not because his message is sophisticated, but because it's emotionally authentic in a way that mainstream culture isn't. The dance down the stairs represents Arthur's final transformation, but it's also a funeral march for the society that created him. Every step represents another failure of human compassion, another missed opportunity for intervention, another moment when someone could have chosen kindness over indifference. By the time Arthur reaches the bottom of those stairs, he's no longer the man who climbed to the top. The Joker is fully born, but so is something else. A mirror that forces society to see what it's created. The colorful makeup, the confident posture, the genuine smile, they're not hiding Arthur's transformation. They're announcing it to a world that finally has to pay attention. The genius of using stairs for this scene is that it represents Arthur's descent into madness, but also his ascent to relevance. In the social hierarchy he's falling, becoming everything society fears and rejects. But in terms of personal power and cultural impact, he's rising, finally achieving the significance he always craved. This paradox captures the central tragedy of the Joker myth. The only way Arthur can matter is by becoming someone who destroys meaning itself. He can only be seen by becoming invisible to his former self. He can only find his voice by abandoning language for pure, terrifying laughter. The final scenes of Arthur's transformation reveal how thoroughly society has failed not just him, but itself. When the riots begin, when people embrace his image as a symbol of resistance, they're not responding to his specific message because he doesn't have one. They're responding to his authenticity, his willingness to stop pretending that the system works for people like them. But this is where the Joker's evolution becomes most dangerous to society. He doesn't represent organized political opposition with specific demands that could be negotiated or addressed. He represents something more fundamental: the complete rejection of social order based on the lived experience that social order has rejected him first. You can't compromise with someone who's given up on the possibility of compromise. You can't reform systems for someone who believes the systems are designed to exclude them. You can't offer justice to someone who's concluded that justice is a myth designed to maintain injustice. The Joker becomes unstoppable not because he's particularly clever or powerful, but because he's willing to embrace consequences that terrify everyone else. He's already lost everything that society uses to control behavior: reputation, relationships, future prospects, even sanity itself. What do you threaten someone with when they've already lost everything worth threatening? This is why the Joker represents such a profound challenge to social order. He's not trying to reform the system or replace it with something better. He's trying to reveal its fundamental contradictions so completely that it becomes impossible to maintain the illusions necessary for its continued existence. The most disturbing realization is that the Joker's critique of society is largely accurate. The systems that failed Arthur do systematically marginalize vulnerable people. The institutions that ignored his suffering do prioritize efficiency over compassion. The culture that mocked his pain does reward conformity over authenticity. He's not wrong about the diagnosis, he's wrong about the cure. Instead of working to heal the social wounds he's identified, he chooses to infect them until they become fatal. Instead of building alternatives to the systems that failed him, he works to destroy the possibility of any system succeeding. But here's the most troubling aspect of his transformation. From Arthur's perspective, it makes perfect sense. Every attempt he made to participate constructively in society was met with rejection, humiliation, or violence. Every effort to seek help was frustrated by underfunding, indifference, or institutional failure. Every expression of vulnerability was treated as weakness to be exploited. Given this history, why would he believe that more participation, more help-seeking, more vulnerability would produce different results? The Joker isn't choosing evil over good, he's choosing a response that makes sense based on the data society has provided him about how it treats people like him. This is where the story becomes most relevant to contemporary social problems. The Joker represents what happens when societies create large populations of people who have no stake in maintaining social order because social order offers them nothing worth maintaining. When you systematically exclude people from opportunities for meaningful work, stable relationships, adequate healthcare, safe housing, and basic dignity, you create conditions where destructive responses become rational choices. When you ignore people's legitimate grievances until they become desperate enough to act destructively, you teach them that destruction is the only form of communication you understand. The Joker's transformation reveals the hidden violence that maintains social stability. We call society civilized because most violence is hidden, delegated to institutions, or directed at people who don't count in our moral calculations. But when someone like Arthur refuses to absorb that violence silently, when he reflects it back at its sources, suddenly the violent foundation of social order becomes visible. This is why the Joker is so terrifying to established powers. He doesn't threaten to replace their violence with his own, he threatens to expose that their stability depends on violence that they've made invisible. He forces society to see its own methods reflected in his actions, stripped of the justifications and institutional structures that make them seem legitimate. The comedy club scene where Arthur bombs catastrophically shows another crucial element of his transformation. He genuinely believes he's funny, that his material will connect with the audience, that his years of studying comedy and writing jokes have prepared him for this moment. But his humor is completely disconnected from normal human experience because his life has been completely disconnected from normal human experience. His jokes are about his trauma, his pain, his bizarre daily reality of caring for a mentally ill mother while struggling with his own mental illness. To him, these experiences are his life, so of course they're worth laughing about. But to the audience, they're disturbing glimpses into suffering they'd rather ignore. This scene captures something essential about how marginalized people experience society. They develop coping mechanisms, perspectives, and forms of meaning that make sense within their circumstances but seem alien or threatening to mainstream culture. When they try to bridge that gap, to share their experiences with the broader community, they're met with incomprehension or hostility. Arthur's failure as a comedian isn't about lack of talent, it's about the impossibility of translating experiences that society refuses to acknowledge into forms of entertainment that society can consume. His material is too real, too painful, too honest for audiences who want comedy to help them forget their problems, not confront them more deeply. But this failure also reveals something important about his character. Even at his lowest points, Arthur is still trying to connect, still hoping to find some way to matter to other people. The Joker represents what happens when those attempts finally stop, when someone gives up on connection and commits fully to disconnection. The evolution from Arthur to Joker isn't just personal psychology, it's social commentary. It shows how societies create the conditions for their own destruction by systematically failing to integrate the people who most need integration. It demonstrates how exclusion eventually produces people who are committed to making exclusion impossible to ignore. Every society has mechanisms for dealing with people who don't fit easily into existing categories. Healthy societies create inclusive institutions, safety nets, and cultural spaces where difference can be accommodated and even celebrated. Unhealthy societies create prisons, mental hospitals, and other forms of isolation that hide problems rather than solving them. Arthur's story shows what happens when these mechanisms fail completely. When someone falls through every safety net, gets rejected by every institution, and finds no cultural space where their existence makes sense, they eventually create their own space by destroying the spaces that excluded them. The Joker's makeup becomes his true face because society never allowed him to develop a genuine identity within legitimate social roles. He couldn't be a successful comedian, a good son, a valued employee, or even a functioning patient within existing systems. All of these identities were frustrated by circumstances beyond his control and institutions that didn't work for people like him. When legitimate identity formation becomes impossible, people create illegitimate identities that can't be taken away by social institutions because they exist in opposition to those institutions. The Joker can't be fired, medicated, evicted, or abandoned because he's already incorporated all of those experiences into his core identity. This is why villain archetypes are often more compelling than hero archetypes. Heroes depend on society's validation to maintain their identities, but villains create their own validation systems that can't be destroyed by external forces. They achieve a form of independence that's terrifying precisely because it's genuine. Arthur's final transformation occurs when he stops trying to be understood and starts trying to be feared. This represents the death of his capacity for hope, but also the birth of his capacity for power. Society finally pays attention to him, not because he's worthy of attention, but because ignoring him has become dangerous. This dynamic explains why mass violence has become such a prominent feature of contemporary society. When conventional forms of social participation are systematically denied to certain populations, violence becomes one of the few remaining ways to assert significance and demand recognition. The Joker doesn't want to be loved anymore, he wants to be remembered. He doesn't want to contribute to society, he wants to expose its contradictions. He doesn't want to heal his trauma, he wants to universalize it so that everyone shares his experience of meaninglessness and isolation. But the most chilling aspect of his transformation is how it reveals the hidden Joker potential in everyone who's watching. Every person who's ever felt invisible, rejected, misunderstood, or abandoned recognizes something in Arthur's journey. Everyone who's ever fantasized about forcing the people who ignored them to finally pay attention sees the appeal of his solution. The Joker exists in the psychological space between legitimate grievance and illegitimate response. His complaints about society are largely valid, but his methods for addressing them are entirely destructive. This combination makes him both sympathetic and terrifying, both victim and perpetrator, both cautionary tale and forbidden fantasy. Most people who relate to Arthur's isolation don't become violent, but they understand the emotional logic that leads from invisibility to revenge. They recognize the appeal of a worldview that explains their suffering in terms of other people's moral failures rather than their own inadequacies. The genius of the Joker myth is that it forces audiences to confront their own capacity for destructive thinking while providing enough psychological distance to explore those thoughts safely. Everyone can imagine circumstances that might push them beyond their normal moral boundaries, but few people have to actually face those circumstances. Arthur's story asks what would happen if society systematically destroyed every source of meaning and connection in your life, then continued to demand that you maintain normal moral behavior. It explores whether human goodness is an inherent trait or a social luxury that depends on certain minimum conditions being met. The answer suggested by Arthur's transformation is deeply unsettling. Goodness appears to be much more fragile and conditional than most people want to believe. When the social conditions that support moral behavior are removed, when people are pushed beyond their psychological breaking points, when hope becomes impossible to maintain, destructive responses become not just understandable but inevitable. This doesn't excuse violence or justify destructive behavior, but it does suggest that preventing such behavior requires maintaining the social conditions that make moral choice possible. It implies that ethical societies have obligations to their most vulnerable members not just out of compassion, but out of self-preservation. The Joker represents the return of society's repressed violence and neglect. He's what comes back when you think you've successfully hidden your failures in institutional structures, economic systems, and cultural narratives that make suffering invisible. He's proof that you can't actually eliminate problems by ignoring them, you can only postpone their expression until they become more destructive. Every Arthur Fleck that society creates and abandons represents a potential Joker waiting to emerge under the right conditions. Not everyone will make that transformation, but the capacity exists in anyone who's been pushed far enough beyond hope and connection. The most terrifying implication is that the Joker isn't an anomaly to be prevented. He's a natural product of social dynamics that are considered normal and acceptable. As long as societies prioritize efficiency over humanity, competition over cooperation, image over substance, they will continue producing people who have nothing left to lose and every reason to ensure that others lose as well. Understanding the Joker means understanding that he's not the problem, he's the symptom. The problem is a social system that creates more Arthur Flecks than it knows what to do with, then acts surprised when some of them refuse to disappear quietly into poverty, addiction, suicide, or madness. The real horror isn't that monsters exist, it's that we're all participating in the machine that creates them, then pretending that their creation has nothing to do with our choices, our priorities, our willingness to look away when looking would require us to change. Arthur Fleck becomes the Joker because society needs him to become the Joker. Not consciously or intentionally but systematically and inevitably. He serves the function of containing and expressing all the violence, nihilism and destructive potential that civilized society generates but refuses to acknowledge. By making him the villain, society can maintain its illusions about its own goodness. By treating him as exceptional rather than representative, it can avoid examining the conditions that created him. By focusing on his crimes rather than his grievances, it can ignore the systematic failures that his existence reveals. But the Joker won't stay contained in the role society assigns him. He refuses to be just another cautionary tale about mental illness or individual moral failure. He insists on being seen as the logical product of specific social conditions that continue to exist and continue to produce similar results. This is why the Joker endures as a cultural symbol. He represents something that societies try very hard to hide from themselves. The knowledge that their stability depends on the suffering of people they've decided don't matter, and that eventually, some of those people will refuse to suffer silently. The dance down the stairs isn't just Arthur's transformation, it's society's reckoning. Every step represents another moment when compassion could have been chosen over indifference, another opportunity when intervention could have prevented catastrophe, another chance when seeing someone's humanity could have preserved everyone's safety. By the time he reaches the bottom, it's too late for everyone. Arthur is gone, replaced by something that can never be reasoned with, never be satisfied, never be integrated back into the social order that created and destroyed him. The Joker is born not from evil but from the exhaustion of good, not from hatred but from the death of love, not from choice but from the elimination of all acceptable choices. And the most disturbing truth is that somewhere in your city, in your community, maybe in your own family, there's another Arthur Fleck taking his first steps down those same stairs, wondering if anyone will notice him before he reaches the bottom, hoping that someone will care enough to interrupt his descent into the darkness that society has prepared for him. The Joker is all of us who looked away. The Joker is what we create when we choose comfort over compassion, when we prioritize our convenience over someone else's humanity, when we decide that some people's pain is acceptable collateral damage for maintaining the systems that benefit us. He's not the exception to human nature, he's human nature stripped of the social supports that make moral behavior possible and rewarding. He's what remains when hope dies, when connection fails, when meaning disappears, when someone finally stops believing that their suffering matters to anyone else. The Joker is the mirror that society doesn't want to look into, because it shows us exactly who we are when we think no one is watching, exactly what we're capable of when our comfort is threatened, exactly how much we're willing to sacrifice other people's well-being to maintain our own illusions of innocence. And the most terrifying thing about that mirror is that it's reflecting something true.